Appreciate it. Good morning. There was a man raised in the middle of a large city who felt compelled to become a rancher. So at the age of 28, he borrowed the 2011 equivalent of $2 million, moved to the country, and bought 17,000 acres. Most of his peers expected him to fail. The ranchers who owned that land before him had failed. We're going to talk about his characteristics and how those characteristics parallel leaders in any industry. My name is Ben Ochs. My company is Palmeau and Associates, and I serve others, mainly company leaders, boards of directors, and I help them with how effectively they enjoy returns in their company through the people in their company. Now here's our challenge. We've got a short amount of time. We've got 18 things. This is going to help me stay on time because I'm going to rattle through them fairly quickly. You have note pages in front of you. You can keep me on track. And then when we sum this up, you'll have a chance to challenge me and ask me questions. How's that? Is that fair? Good. Okay. Let's start with the first one, vision. The gentleman we're talking about had to know what he wanted to do. He had to have a clear vision. Without it, he wouldn't have known which steps to take to embark on this major journey. He had to have self-knowledge. How do we know what we can take on if we don't know our aptitudes? He had to know what he could do, what he couldn't do, and what was likely to succeed. So by knowing where he started, he knew what he could attempt. Here's a guy who was raised in the middle of a large city and he was going to become a rancher. His only experience with agriculture to that point was working on a golf course. So, once he made the decision, he went and got his agriculture degree from Oregon State in 2 years and then started searching for land. Risk tolerance. Well, he just borrowed $2 million. He was going to a place he really didn't know anything about. He was going from the wet, city-oriented atmosphere to the desert around people who didn't know him. So he had to be prepared to leap in all the way. Now, there's the macro risk that we see here, the whole borrowing the money and making business decisions, but there was the micro risk that he took that was cyclical, based on the cycle of the year and being fully accountable for things over which he had very little influence, like, say, the weather. Sometimes he needed it to rain and couldn't make it rain, and other times he needed it not to rain, and it would. When you have hay on the ground, you don't want it to rain. Commitment. All 4 feet in the trough. He couldn't dabble in it. He couldn't afford to be a gentleman farmer and see if it worked, and then when it was going okay, decide to leave another form of income and do it. There was no way to do that. He had to go all the way. Keep thinking now about leaders you know or what you would expect from a corporate or company leader. Commitment, I already said that. Hard work, out before breakfast, 10 minutes for lunch, out after dinner. Yes, leaders do that, but especially early on. He didn't do that forever, but there was a time where when he first started, he had to put everything he had into his goal, his vision, his dream. So he wasn't afraid of hard work. Organization. I want to talk about organization and planning together. Some of you may see organization and planning as a difference without distinction. I do. Consider this. Let's say you have a table full of disparate objects, and you challenge someone to group them in ways that appear logical to them. That's organization. Deciding which objects to put on the table and why you want them to put them into groups, that's planning. You see the difference? Organizing things is different than planning. Okay, so in the practical sense, in my character's experience, he was faced with deciding his hired help's highest and best use on any given day and seasonally. So you have a very predictable cycle. During certain seasons, certain things have to be done. Within that season, on any given day, certain things hold priority over other things. That's not unique to ranching, but you see how he had to make those decisions, just as company leaders do. Industry knowledge. Challenging the way, quote, things have always been done, end quote. In the area where this rancher began, no one had electric irrigation pumps, main lines, pressurized irrigation systems, sprinklers. They flood irrigated. Here's the problem. Morning. The land wasn't flat. Secondly, it undulated. So it wasn't just a slope, there were high spots and low spots. Their returns reflected that. There were places dried out and starving for water, thirsting for water, and other places that were flooded. He saw the problem, and instead of trying to level this ground that was clearly not levelable, it's a new word, he put in an irrigation system where he could deliver the water uniformly, and it worked. But it was a huge risk, financially and operationally. But the industry knowledge was the key thing. He had to know that that was possible, how to do it, and then find the equipment and put it all in place. Started with, I believe, about 3 miles of steel main line that he had to weld together. And then, of course, all the irrigation pipe that went off of that. Citizenship. This gentleman was chairman of the school board. He belonged to numerous agricultural associations. He was gracious and unexpectant in giving. He's a man of great faith and acted consistent with that. Back to the unexpected giving. I remember him talking about how his decisions weren't based on whether this would look good to people who might come into his men's clothing store, or whether they would come and do business with him as an attorney or in his grocery store. He was completely non-dependent on that. So when he gave because it was the right thing to do. He didn't have ulterior motives. Communication, instruction, correction, sharing credit, motivating employees and suppliers to action, and using humor. Here's a guy who needed to get people to do things. He couldn't be in their presence all the time. He had to know that when they parted company, those people would have a vested interest in doing their best, completing their work on his behalf toward his greater goal. You can do that with a baseball bat. You can stand over people and force them to do things, but one thing that's very consistent about human nature is that when you leave them after they've been motivated with a baseball bat, the resentment sets in, and they will find ways, consciously or not, to drag their feet. They resent the fact that they've been forced to do something, intimidated into doing something. People are much more productive when they feel that there's a reason that they want to invest themselves on your behalf. He was very good at that. He knew how to use humor, and he used humor to build people up, not tear them down, and to put them at ease. Innovation. He was always looking for greater efficiencies, greater effectiveness through processes and people. Yes, there were times when he selected the wrong people, and they broke equipment, or they didn't show up on time, or they couldn't be trusted, or they had other problems that made them ineffective. But he became a very good judge of character and was very good at choosing people over time. Problem solving. All right. He's miles from help, facing a time-critical breakdown or some other problem. His ability to think in situ, in the moment, diagnose issues, identify the problems, identify remedies, and then implement them on his own, without which the problem would be exacerbated. Essential, key. Take out my opening clause there, that he's miles from help. Think of a company leader who's facing some sort of critical issue or problem, who has to think on his or her feet, identify the problems, the root causes, identify and consider remedies, and then implement them, without which the problem is exacerbated. It's a direct parallel. Resourcefulness. Drawing upon all those people and things at his disposal, always with the big picture in mind. It freed him from pursuing them apologetically. What that means is that when there's a clear goal, when the vision is clear and certain things have to be done, you're not guessing, you're not hoping, then those resources at your disposal and those people at your disposal, you go to unapologetically. You've got a bigger yes that says, I don't have to feel self-conscious about doing it. Here's one of this man's hallmarks. He borrowed a lot of stuff. Equipment, when he first got there, he didn't have the equipment, he didn't have the money to buy it, and he went to his neighbors and he said, I need to do this, may I borrow your equipment? And to their credit, they let him. But over time, it was very easy because he became known as someone who always returned it at least as good as or better than when he got it. And he couldn't hesitate. He knew he had to take that risk and go make that request, because without it, he wouldn't succeed. Unapologetically. He had diverse skills. In our specific case, animal husbandry, horticulture, chemistry, finance, management, mechanical, jury rigging. That's where you fix stuff with baling wire and chewing gum on the spot because you need to get going. Those are essential skills. Now think about the leaders you know who are effective. And I expect that those people are not singular in their talent or in their aptitude. They have diverse skills. They know things about things. And some of those are intangible. They might have started as an engineer or an accountant, but they're good at communicating. They pick things up quickly. They sense people. They know how to organize, manage, be efficient. And they probably have some interests outside their work that, again, makes them more diverse. It makes a person more robust. This is a counterintuitive truth. Complex systems are more stable than simple systems. Have you ever heard that before? Okay. What that means, it sounds counterintuitive because, well, if it's complex, then that means it's more likely to break down, there's more moving parts. That's complicated. Complex means that if one part breaks, the whole thing doesn't collapse. The best parallel is an electrical circuit. A series circuit is just a single wire going to, let's say, a light bulb and back to ground. If the wire breaks anywhere, the whole thing shuts down. But if you have a parallel circuit, more complex, one part breaks, the rest can still operate, right? So bring that analogy or metaphor back to the leader. A leader who has diverse skills and lots of experience is usually more able to handle diverse challenges than one who's like, well, this isn't engineering, I don't know what to do with it. Fair? Good. Management. Here's an example. Branding cattle, and our leader has 2 crews going. Early on, he made the mistake of having one of the jobs. In his case, usually branding, actually handling the branding iron. But you've got dehorning, castrating, earmarking, vaccinating, lots of stuff going on, and a certain amount of equipment. And what would happen is that he would get distracted, he'd get pulled away because somebody needed something. They broke a hypodermic needle or they had some other problem. So what he became famous for saying was, my job is to not have a job. which was interesting. An interesting way to say this. My job is to make sure you can all keep doing your jobs. And he stayed busy all day, moving from place to place, fixing things and supplying things and helping people. Management. He knew how to make sure everybody who was working could keep working. Ethics. Always above board and aggressively avoiding situations and people that represented threats to his personal, his professional, and his financial integrity. And these things were, again, consistent with his great faith. He knew what was right. He was unabashed and unapologetic about holding to that. And he just never wavered on it. There was never a question. What did that do? Well, everyone with whom he worked or did business was confident. If he said he would do something, if he said he would pay something, if he wanted to borrow something, there was never hesitation. Because they didn't have that split second, well, you're just going to afford to lose this, because if I loan it to this guy, I don't know when I'm going to get it back, or if I will, or if it'll be broken when I see it. Never an issue. Which leads us to the next one, restraint. He said no to easy money. This is an interesting little paradox here. At first he couldn't get it. Here's a guy who routinely would answer the door and have whoever came to the door ask if his father was home. And he would say, well, he probably is. He doesn't live here, but he's probably home. Here's a young guy who's got all this debt and all this responsibility, and he couldn't get any money. Who would take the risk? Short's version is, once he finally was able to get money, then they wanted to give him a lot more. After all, I had all this collateral, right? But he knew what he needed, and he borrowed what he needed. And when they said, well, gee, don't you want to put new carpet in the house? Or isn't there a car you'd like to buy, or a pickup? No. This is what I need. I appreciate you loaning it to me. Thank you. That's a temptation that a lot of people can't resist. And as a leader, you have the same challenge, right? When do you say no? Where's your restraint? How do you make sure that you're doing what you need to do, no more? Discernment. Discernment is big. Who could he trust? He was a trusting guy, generally. And it pains him, I know, that some of the people he considered his best friends, his most trusted friends, dishonored their word, even went against the written letter of agreements at times. And that it jaded him a bit. But it got him to the point where he realized, I can't just expect that people are going to do the right thing. I have to be careful and discerning about those with whom I operate. And then further discernment. When did he leverage indignation and directness over diplomacy and space? You see, as we become known for a certain style of behavior, when we act outside that norm, what is normal for us, it's effective, it gets attention. So here's my example. If I'm usually self-controlled and I have a sense of calm and I handle things that way, and one time I get a little agitated, I raise my voice, I slap the table, I point my finger. People notice that. And they know, well, something's unusual here, I need to pay attention. But if I'm always yelling, always pointing my finger, and always emphasizing things, then when things get bad and I really need to make a point and I do it more, it's just more noise. You see? And one day when I want to be soft, it's an anomaly. Like, we know what's going to happen. We know you're going to go back to, being you. Well, this guy knew how and when to leverage, as I said, indignation and directness over diplomacy. Sometimes it was needed, but he didn't abuse it. And finally, wisdom. This is one of my most, it's one of the most interesting things, the most important things to me. And as I study leaders and as I help leaders, a lot of what we've already talked about comes through wisdom. Time, experience, education, maturity, perspective. It's the wisdom that undergirds so many decisions, and a person's ability to maintain that sense of calm and that professionalism and diplomacy in a situation that is highly charged and has a lot riding on it, but a lot at stake, and a lot of stakeholders depending on it, comes through that wisdom. And I've heard, I haven't researched this, but I've heard that Gandhi, for example, never had a written contract because he knew what he knew, and he knew what he would do, and other people knew what he would do because he was so consistent that if he said, "No, this is what I do in these situations," he was not questioned. He didn't waver. That's part of wisdom. It's knowing yourself, knowing what to do, knowing how to treat people. So, summing up again, look through this list. What on there could you say the leader of any corporation wouldn't need? I'm not saying this is everything they need. But here we are. This is a rancher. You say rancher and you have this vision in your head about, well, a rancher. Hayseed, put on a tractor, riding a horse or whatever. He employed all of these all the time. And he was successful. So remember when I said his peers bet on his failure? That was in 1958. He just sold, not too long ago, a fair amount of his land as part of his retirement, which was always his plan. He operated it actively for over 50 years. He's still living in the house that he was in 1958. He did all right. And he made more on the sale of that portion of he made 10 times on the portion of land that he sold, that he paid for the whole ranch. He has friends, he's respected, he's financially secure, his family's all right. I think that defines success. Questions? Comments? Yes, sir.
Would you share his name with us?
Sure. His name's Ronald B. Ochs. He's my father. He's 80 years old as of last May. He still flies the antique biplane that he restored, does aerobatics. He flies his Cessna 180 and exercises every day. Pretty sharp. And since I said that, my mother's still living. She's also 80 as of November. Thank you. The question was, what was his name? Thanks. Yes, sir. The question is, when I work with business leaders, which of these 18 is most needed and why? I'll combine a couple of them. The one is communication. The first thing that comes to mind is communication. And the reason I say a couple of them is because communication as a skill, technical skill, isn't enough. It has to be undergirded by wisdom. So we start with the issue around communication and how that affects people's willingness to invest themselves, as I said earlier. And with the wisdom comes perspective. With perspective comes wisdom. So I help them with, do you understand how just being good at communicating, grammar, technical sides of communication, isn't enough. It's the wisdom that's behind it that really makes a difference. Thank you. Other questions? Yes, ma'am. The comment really is, why isn't tenacity on there? I think you're right, it could be. And like I say, there's all these things are critical. Not all critical things are on here. Tenacity, if you'll allow me, is embedded in hard work, commitment, risk-taking, those things. But yes, tenacity, absolutely. And if you'll allow me, going out before breakfast to work, taking 10 minutes for lunch, going out after dinner to continue working, borrowing things because it has to be done or we don't survive. It's kind of wrapped up in that, but it's a great word. Thanks. Other questions? Yes, sir. Good question. The question was around, it referred to getting people to do work, encouraging people to do work on your behalf and for the operations behalf, and then having them essentially let you down, whether it's an employee or a vendor. And do you then have to become more forceful? Yes. And I have, in my work, I have what I call my escalation plan. And the short version of that is this. You start diplomatically, and the proportion of diplomacy over directness is heavily weighted toward diplomacy. In other words, you let people know this is what you need, what you expect, and give them the chance to do the right thing. And then in a sort of an exponential curve, you work your way toward where directness is outweighing diplomacy. Here's the key thing. By the time you get to the point where, as I said earlier, there's a certain amount of indignance, you're slapping the table, you're pointing a finger, you're being very direct. The main thing is that the person to whom you're speaking has to know, and they cannot deny, that he or she has had several opportunities before that to make the right decision for the right reasons. It's a very different scene if you go straight to that. So discernment is, where do I start and how rapidly do I ramp this up? And of course that will be based on the situation. It can be 3 minutes if it's an emergency. There's a fire, tractor's rolling down the hill, or it could be over several months. It depends on the size of the project. But it also requires follow-up on the longer term things. But I think the discernment really does have to do with that balance. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Could you elaborate on
The question was, would I expand on discernment, and how do you know what your strengths are and when to focus on strengths or weaknesses? Is that fair? Okay. First of all, it's experience. So one of the things I worry about, let's say with my kids, is that they're growing up in the city. And there's a certain amount of time in front of the television, and there's, sedentary periods that I didn't experience a lot. What? Right. So, right. They didn't work on a ranch. So I started driving when I was 4 years old. And no kidding. About that time, when we would feed cattle in the wintertime, we would kneel on the seat of the truck while they were feeding hay off the back, and we would use the manual choke to rev the engine up a little bit. And you could do that a certain amount. If you did it too far, of course, you choked it out, but you could, and the steering was this big, you're looking through the middle of it, My point being, self-knowledge is not easy to attain without doing things. So when people say, well, I don't want to try that because I don't like it, my first question is, how do you know? There's certain moral boundaries I might not go over. Like, for example, I don't know what it's like to experience heroin, and I don't want to find out just so I can say I don't like it. I have a boundary that I won't cross. But when it comes to other experiences, I'm willing to say, well, sure, I'm interested in skydiving or bungee jumping or hiking the Grand Canyon or, driving race cars, which I still do. All because those things give me a broader experience. It helps me know what I can and can't do. I've also done things that I have learned, I'm not good at this. Like, I sang at a wedding once, which I kind of did as a favor. They haven't asked me back. It's first of all testing yourself, giving yourself experiences, accepting those invitations to do things you normally wouldn't. Again, within your moral and ethical boundaries. And then paying attention while you do it. Not just sort of blindly going along in this experience just for the fun of it, but thinking, did I like this? And who do I see myself surrounded by when I'm in an activity like that? And would I be comfortable in that group? Would I find myself gaining aptitude, what am I trying to say, mastery fairly quickly, or would I not? Some people, for example, pick up languages very quickly. Some people don't. Some people are tone deaf. Some people are, have a perfect ear. But how would you know unless you experience that? So when it comes to business, I think you heard in my introduction that I owned my first retail business at the age of 24. You would never guess what it was, so I'll tell you. Women's clothing. I had no interest in women's clothing. I wanted to be in business, so I had an opportunity and I did it. But what I learned through the experience was, don't be in business doing something you're not interested in. You have to invest yourself so much into it that if you don't like it, don't do it. I know now that I'll never be in the women's clothing business again. But I do know how to put them on hangers.
We'll have time for one more question.
One more question. Yes, sir.
Who's running the ranch while you're doing your women's clothing business?
Who's running the ranch while I'm doing my women's clothing business? Well, first of all, I never ran the ranch. It was my father's. And while I was, when I had my first stores, I had the first store and later on opened a second store in a different city. I was teaching high school and coaching and working on my master's degree. And I was not yet married, which made a big difference. I could just, my time was my own, and so I could just invest myself in it. But there's no connection between running the ranch and the clothing stores. I just, by then I was, of course, out of college as an undergrad. So, thank you. Appreciate your time.